Now, another issue here is around governance. I probably don't need to tell you all this, but this is, something that is very often focused only on the AI life cycle, the model development life cycle. So where is data coming from? How is it accessed? Who actually has access to it? But there's been much less focus on the purpose for which it's analyzed. There are some GDPR to some degree mentions intended use case, but when we talk about governance and how we go from inference to actual decision making, there's actually very little focus on this particular area. Who is responsible for making sure it's good, for actually making sure that it's constantly updated and optimized, and actually measuring effects in the first place. There's very little kind of integration for the space between taking what a machine says and trusting it and running with it in the governance conversation and sort of accountability, generally speaking. Transparency and explainability, I already mentioned a little bit. This is kind of the black box issue. Why does the AI generate the output that it does? Why certain data can corrupt models? We still don't understand that. Explainability generally is a UX issue. And so explainability for a data scientist is going to be very different than for an executive, than for a regulator, than for a consumer. This is a huge challenge, not just in deciding whether or not I take the output, the advice of the machine, but how can I even justify it myself? If I'm a call center agent and my customer is saying, well, why didn't I get access to this loan? What am I going to say? So there's a huge trust issues, huge UX issues around understanding, how the sausage is made using AI today. Another is erroneousness, when the model simply gets it wrong. Consequences abound, and this is, I have the example here of a man named Robert Julian Borchak-Williams, who was wrongfully accused by an algorithm, essentially pulled into the police station and stripped down, asked all these different questions. He wasn't even at the scene of the crime. It was an error altogether. And this obviously has a kind of smell to it around, digital dragnetting and automated policing and racial bias. But, there are many examples of machines just simply getting it wrong. And part of where we are with AI today is that this bridge between inference and reference has in many ways been glossed over because it didn't really matter that much. When we take an inference and use it as a reference in advertising, or to tell me that I'm going to like the blue shoes more than the red shoes with the white soles or whatever, it doesn't really matter. When we take the inference to recommend this musical artist over that one, it doesn't really matter. But as we shift from advertising into other realms like hiring, like access to capital, like politics, policing, health, erroneousness has a much bigger potential impact. Compliance and audibility is another one. I mentioned this through the standpoint of explainability and being able to actually see and apply regulations or legal protections in the code or in how models work. But this is a huge area, and there's so many different realms of AI that just don't have a clear liability to them at all. And this, by the way, is one of the barriers to business adoption. But there's many different legal implications of AI inferences used for decision making. Now, there's also some interesting opportunities here. I mentioned that we cover, convergence of different technologies. And so, for example, we've seen companies in the financial space who are taking AI generated inferences or outputs and putting a hash on them, adding them to a very sort of internal blockchain, if you like, simply to designate, okay, this was something that came from the AI, to try to essentially put a watermark on something that is AI generated versus not. And it can still be used, but there's still a documentation. So just one small example of, this is a huge challenge for AI generally, whether we're talking about inferences or otherwise. But there are also some interesting kind of opportunities for integration across different technologies. Discrimination and disenfranchisement, this is where finally a lot of the conversation is really starting to expose the diverse exclusionary impacts of AI inferences. And again, sometimes this is erroneous, sometimes it's nefarious, sometimes it's just a function of having no transparency into this. This is a hugely tied not just to hiring and access to capital and education and health, but also to the digital divide generally. I'll give you another example. You may have heard of automated underwriting, which is kind of like underwriting in the past, except where we used to use government issued documents, or that you have purchased a house and paid it off, or a car and paid it off. Now companies are using what's called automated underwriting, which is pulling your digital footprint, your big data footprint, how often you pay for your Netflix, all of your online subscriptions. It's using kind of big, more modern social e-commerce digital data to assess your creditworthiness. Now, a lot of people say, well, this is actually great for folks who ordinarily wouldn't have access to financial system, accounting, whatever, or who wouldn't have access to a loan in the first place. But again, remember, I mentioned that we've done a lot of work with the elderly population. These are folks who don't have a digital footprint. So even when we have an opportunity such as automated underwriting, which can seemingly increase access, in this case, to capital, there are other ways where ignoring the tail actually has a huge impact on the scale of populations who more and more need access to capital more than ever, older folks. So there's all kinds of two sides of the same coin when we talk about AI discrimination and disenfranchisement based on some of these inferences. Another area is around human vulnerabilities. I mean, I probably don't need to tell you all this. We've seen that AI, this is the media's favorite AI article. A new study says that AI can predict your political orientation. AI can predict your mood from the way that you walk. AI can predict your sexual orientation. Anything that is perceived as a vulnerability is used as a bias for decision making, is used to manipulate humans. This is sort of our current crisis around the use of our data against us in ways that we can't even actually see or control at all.